our behaviour is contagious and our actions really have a ripple effect. We can do things that have a much more profound impact on the happiness of others than I think we realise. I look back at videos of when I worked in climate change, a topic I was very passionate about, but I hadn't yet found, I think, my calling. So when I watch videos of those days, I'm quite lacking in that sense of purposefulness. I find it interesting to note that when we find the thing that really drives us and is the thing that we most want to bring to the world, it does really bring an energy that I had not discovered until that point in my life. One of the keys to changing the world is experiencing that personal change that gives you that conviction.
Welcome to the Flourishing Minds Fund podcast. My name is Chris Underhill and I'm your host today. I'm a mentor and social entrepreneur in the field of well-being and global mental health. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Mark Williamson, the co-founder and executive director of Action for Happiness. Mark, you're most welcome.
Thank you, Chris. It's lovely to be with you.
Lovely. Obviously, I'm keen to focus mostly on the work of Action for Happiness, a wonderful organization and movement. But I first thought it would be interesting for listeners to know a little bit about yourself. Now, when we were talking about this the other day, preparing for the podcast, we lit upon the idea of what we call 2 awakenings and 2 books as a useful way of drawing the several ideas together. Mark, why don't you jump in and elucidate a little bit on what we were talking about?
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I feel my personal journey does illuminate some important themes that we'll talk about later with the work of Action for Happiness. In the late 90s, early 2000s, I was working as a business consultant, had been for many years, and was very stressed. And I developed really serious debilitating back pain. I was told some quite scary things, that I had a degenerative disease that might leave me in a wheelchair by the time I was 40. I'm happy to say I'm now 50 and not in that situation. And I was told I had a damaged spine and various other frightening things, and that all added to my stress. My wife, though, who was training to be an osteopath and recognized that maybe what was going on for me might be related to how I was living as much as problems with my back. And she gave me a wonderful book, the first of these awakenings that came from a book. It was called Back Sense. And it helped me realize that actually most back pain, and certainly my back pain, was caused by muscle tension. Very real, but actually more about me doing that classic British male thing of working hard, caring deeply about wanting to impress others, but not talking about my feelings at all, keeping that all bottled up. So the mental pain, if you like, was coming out as physical pain. So this book woke me up to the connection between my mental and physical health. But I also learnt some breathing exercises, which we would now call mindfulness, but back in those years wasn't such a well-known term. And that, amazingly, to my great surprise, left me with a shift in my attitude and these breathing techniques, able to move again, to be free from pain in a way I hadn't been for years. And it was a very life-changing moment and was the first step towards this journey.
I can well imagine that was an incredible, literally speaking, relief. And I can understand how you might have been skeptical at first, and then obviously because your wife is so involved in professionally in the osteopathy profession, and of course that would have been enormously helpful. I can see that. So what happened next then?
Well, yes, you're right, Chris. I was skeptical. I think that's a really important point. I have a science background. I thought, this is a serious stuff. But of course, what the science shows is that actually there's a huge mental component to our perceptions of pain and suffering. And of course, we all know the placebo effect is a very real thing, and our expectations do shape to some extent our physical responses. And I was expecting my back to be sore and I was very stressed. But the next step was wanting to get away from that business culture. And for me, that was escaping to do an MBA. I went to a Swiss business school. expecting to carry on in another part of the commercial world. But I had a second awakening while there, because we had the opportunity to work with a therapist
Right.
whilst at this school, IMD it's called.
Mhm.
And that was a huge turning point for me to sort of tap into my inner life and be recognize some of the subconscious things I was carrying with me about my childhood years, about my worries and fears, and who I was really trying to impress, and so on. And while I was going through this therapeutic process, I also read a book by a now hero and friend of mine, Richard Layard, an economist who was probably the first Western economist to call for a shift in our priorities away from making economic growth the central priority to instead saying we should be growing human happiness.
Yes.
And that had a big impact on me during this year of business study. So I had a personal awakening to my inner life, and I had a realization that what mattered more to me wasn't growing the bottom line of companies, but it was helping us all wake up to what really matters for happiness.
Yeah.
And so, as they say, the rest is history. And for the almost 12 years now since then, and I had the chance to meet Richard and work with him, we together helped set up Action for Happiness, and this non-profit, but also movement, as you mentioned, has been growing in various ways ever since.
It's a marvelous story, isn't it? I mean, right there, we could just finish the podcast because it's such a fantastic journey. I know that that's a little bit of a hackneyed phrase these days, but it really is true in your case. And I've had the privilege of meeting Richard once or twice, and of course you work with him on a regular basis. But he's an extraordinarily impressive person when it comes to this particular argument. And in fact, he's made quite an impact in many governments and countries. So I think that's an important feature of this. Well, so there we are. You've got us to the edge of the description now of this wonderful organization, Action for Happiness. I wonder whether you'd care to talk a little bit about one of the words in that title, which of course is happiness.
Yes, I think it's really important, Chris, when we talk about happiness, to be careful. One of the reasons I'm so passionate about this word is that I think of it in a rather more Aristotelian sense of a life well lived, not just a momentary pleasant experience, which I think is what modern consumer culture tries to sell us, that happiness comes from a fizzy drink or the best trainers or a beautiful holiday experience.
Yeah.
But that actually what we're all searching for deep down is a sense of life going well, and that life is not just pleasant but also meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, in talking about happiness, we must be careful to not stigmatize unhappiness, because all of our emotional experiences are hugely important. They are signals to us. So when we are sad, it's because we've lost something. When we're angry, it's because we've been wronged. These are valid human emotional experiences. And when we're unhappy, it's a sign, it's a signal. And in pursuing happiness, no one is saying it is wrong to be unhappy. In fact, what we're really saying is, let's do all we can to understand the challenges people face and help them have a greater chance of flourishing. So I just wanted to start really by saying that this pursuit of happiness, action for happiness, is towards a nuanced sort of sense of a contented life, recognizing that life has ups and downs and we all struggle at times, and that's okay. It's part of the human condition.
I think it's so important that you've emphasized early in the description of the work that this is not about stigmatizing those who, for whatever reason, are unhappy, or, if you like, not happy. I think that's terribly important, and it has a kind of equalizing and effect. It actually makes it easier for me, for example, to access your ideas of happiness. A life well lived seems to me to be something that we could all aspire to, actually. So I think that's wonderful.
And I think, Chris, it is something we all aspire to, because if you ask parents what they want most for their children,
Mm.
the most common response by far is along the lines of, I just want them to be happy. And what they mean by that is healthy and safe and successful and connected to others. But we talk about this word, this is the word we use to describe the thing we want the most for the people we love the most. And that's why I think Action for Happiness has attracted this huge global community in a way that we wouldn't if we'd been talking about action for flourishing or action for mental well-being. It's got a humanness, it's got a, it feels like daily conversation.
Right. So a common humanity, if one might say.
Yes.
Yeah, I can see that. So I know we're going to talk about what you actually do in a minute, but first of all, just tell us a little bit about the mission of the organization.
Well, I think every good mission should be incredibly bold, and ours certainly is ambitious, and it's to create a happier and kinder world, where as many people as possible are flourishing and as few are suffering. We see far too much unnecessary suffering in our world, Chris, as you and all of our listeners here know. The key thing about Action for Happiness is the action is about the fact that we can play a role in moving towards that big picture vision. So first of all, we can all do things that affect our own happiness and well-being. There are many science-based practical things, and certainly many of them have changed my life, that really make a difference. And just, we would love as many people as possible to be aware of them, whether that's mindful practices or reframing difficult situations or improving our relationships. But the even more important thing is that our behavior is contagious and our actions really have a ripple effect, so that we can do things that have a much more profound impact on the happiness of others than I think we realize. So the way that we are, not just as parents and family members, but also as friends and colleagues and community members, we have the chance to contribute to this better world that we would like to see in a very meaningful way.
Absolutely. I'm reminded of the fact that you mentioned bodily pain when you were talking about yourself, and what effectively is the somatic pain that you were talking about, and in a sense that plays through in the mission, doesn't it? That recognition plays through in some different ways, which I think is rather fascinating.
Well, yes, there's lots of things that come up for me hearing that, Chris. One is, of course, a lot of the physical pain we experience is in some way related to emotional and mental trauma and suffering that we're carrying, perhaps often unaware of it. But I think in some ways also, as I think you reminded me when we spoke before, that what we're trying to do with Action for Happiness is a bit like the awakening I had personally for the world, helping as many people as possible wake up to what really matters for a fulfilling life. It's not the economic success and the material things. It's more about the, feeling comfortable in our own skin, feeling connected to others, and feeling that what we do in life matters and makes a difference.
Yes, absolutely. Well, look, Mark, let's take a deep dive, and let me ask you, what are the actual, what's the nitty-gritty of the organization? How does this come about? Because I know that there's a lot of substance beneath these important opening statements around the mission.
Thank you. I like the use of the word substance, Chris, because particularly when talking about what you might call a fluffy topic like happiness, the substance really helps to make this credible and engaging. So someone like Richard Layard, who's a professor, and many other sort of scientific experts lend a sort of credence to this, because everything we do with Action for Happiness is built on a foundation of research and science. So although we're trying to make this as accessible as possible, it's not wishful thinking. It's not some self-proclaimed guru giving you their latest, pop wisdom. So we think about the work of Action for Happiness in 3 different layers. You might think of it as a sort of funnel or a journey that we would love people to go on. I'll just name them all, then we can talk about them in a little bit more detail. So there's outreach, there's engagement, and there's community building. So outreach is the sort of beginning of that funnel. It's how do we reach as many people as possible Engagement is about, then once someone has connected with the idea of the central premise, if you like, what can they do to make that part of their daily life, to make it a habit, to do a practical step? And then the community building, which is really where we want to get people to, is how do we bring people together face to face to not only experience this themselves, but to be in connection to others, to have a sense of community, which is so important for happiness, and to meet others and form friendships and to support each other. So I could tell a little story that goes with each of those sort of areas, if that would be helpful, Chris, to bring it to life.
I think so, because it would sort of bring it to life, wouldn't it? Yeah, it'd be great.
Well, with the outreach, there's what you mentioned earlier on, that this is a movement, and we have grown this community. There are over 600,000 members.
600,000?
600,000 signed up members
Wow.
in almost every country of the world, although predominantly English speaking at this stage. And with a movement, there's so many joys that you get, but one is a lot of the best ideas come from the people, not from the central tiny organization in our case. And a few years ago, a volunteer called Peter got in touch and said, I've got an idea for a kindness calendar as an alternative Christmas Advent calendar to use in my church community. Can I mention Action for Happiness? And I looked at it and thought, this is lovely. It's a every day you can do something calendar of kind acts. Why don't we turn it into a resource that we share? So we did that and put it out. And the next day I had a call from our web agency who said, well, the bad news is your website's gone down. Sorry. But the good news is over 1 million people have tried to download your kindness calendar.
Oh, goodness.
So that was remarkable. But it's grown from there now, many years on, to a series of monthly action calendars that go all year round, following a slightly painful alliterating sequence from Friendly February and Mindful March and Active April and Joyful June, Self-Care September. That you get the picture. But they have now reached 50 million people that have accessed, downloaded and used these resources. And I find them in school classrooms, on hospital walls, in workplace corridors, shared online. So it's a lovely example of both a movement created thing, but also something that has genuinely reached and inspired people in a way that we were never expecting.
That's incredible. I just love that. But the numbers are so amazing, aren't they?
They really are. And I think that's one of the things that you know that you're tapping into that movement potential when you find something, a bright spot, if you like, that you can help amplify. So it wasn't really our genius. It was more the genius of listening to people, spotting a good idea and then trying to amplify it.
Yes.
But having got people's attention is only the beginning, Chris. And of course, what we all know is that behavior change is really hard. So we can have the best intentions, but making that part of our lives is tricky. We have wired in habits. And so engagement, our next sort of layer, is about saying, okay, you're here. How can you do something? So we have a free program called 10 Days of Happiness. It's an online initiative that people can do on their own time. It's got a little animated video every day. And you have a coach called Abby who teaches you a little practical skill that you then practice, and then you note down interactively how you're going to put that into practice that day. And again, delighted with the big numbers. 150,000 people have now completed that online program, and the evidence suggests it has a really big impact on their well-being. And if they like it, we then invite them to join a program all year round where they get an action every day. And there's an app community where people get sent the action every day. And another lovely human story is all the people who step forward to be moderators of that community. And one of the things I love the most is when people say it's the antithesis of social media. Instead of everyone being mean to each other, they're all really kind to each other. So when somebody responds to that day's action and they might say, I'm really struggling today, or I'm not sure I can cope right now, a flurry of people will respond to them with kindness and listening and signposting. And that to me is really heartwarming, Chris.
Of course. That's an amazing achievement to have pulled that together like that, and it's not taken that long either, has it? I mean, that's the other thing to remember, that all of this has taken, what is it, 12 years now?
Yes, and I think a lot of the acceleration has happened mostly in the last few years. So it's taken us a while to build some of these resources. But when you're movement building, if you're able to let go of the things that don't work and focus on the things that do work, then that you can sort of reach that sort of takeoff point. Yes. where it starts to grow more rapidly. Yeah. But the thing we really want people to get to, Chris, is the last of those three layers. It's community building, where you get together with others. Yeah. And so we have developed a face-to-face course. It was running only in the real world before COVID. It was running only in online world in the immediate COVID and post-COVID times, and is now in a sort of blended world. And the idea is it's a number of weeks. It's a weekly session. You get together. It's led by volunteers. That's crucial. We ask for a voluntary donation, but you can attend for free. And it's not about learning from experts. It's about learning together, but it is based in the science. And we are quite unique as a non-profit of our size, that we have done an actual randomized controlled trial, which, as many listeners will know, is the gold standard way of assessing any health intervention. And it showed that relative to a control group, a matched control, that the program reduces mental health challenges. So we see depression and anxiety go down. It boosts well-being. So we see life satisfaction and other measures go up. But crucially, it also makes people more pro-social, which of course is part of our mission. So people say things like, people report feeling more compassionate and also trusting others more. So it's a sort of way of rebuilding that thing that I feel we're really in danger of losing, Chris, that sense of togetherness. And you said earlier, common humanity, the looking for the good in others.
Yeah.
It's the opposite of polarization in a way.
Yeah. As we've been going through this podcast, I can see the enthusiasm bubbling in you. And I'm not sure, you're probably not aware of it, but it's so compelling to see that, and to see, and to think about the change that you've wrought in yourself, and then the change that has come about for all of these individuals that you're now talking about. I wanted to ask you just a little bit more about the people in this movement.
Well, Chris, sorry, just because something's come up as you said that, which is, I hope, of relevance to this audience, actually. So you're really right that I have been changed by this process. You can hear it and see it in me. I look back at videos of when I did previous work. I worked actually after my corporate life for a while in climate change, a topic I was very passionate about, but I hadn't yet found, I think, my calling, as my mum would refer to it. And so when I watch videos of those days, or indeed look back at my corporate life, I'm quite wooden. I'm quite lacking in that sense of purposefulness. And so I find it interesting to note that when we find the thing that really drives us and is the thing that we most want to bring to the world, it does really bring an energy that I had not discovered until that point in my life. And I know that you work with many inspiring social entrepreneurs. And I think one of the keys to changing the world is experiencing that personal change that gives you that conviction.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. It's literally walking the talk and living it, isn't it?
Yes.
It's not so much that it's a dream, because that would then make the whole point, your point about a life well lived, unrealistic. It's not just a dream. It's actually a reality that one can live. And that's, I think, very important. Just tell me a little bit more then about the people who actually work and volunteer for, because many of them are volunteers, as you said, in fact, the vast majority. So give us a little bit of a sense of who they are, how they come to the movement.
Sure. Well, I guess if we're talking about people, I should start with the fact that we have a trustee board, and are really blessed to have good governance. Not only Richard, who is the chair, who I mentioned earlier, but people from the world of social innovation and health, and we have the CEO of a major mental health charity on our board. So I feel blessed to have that kind of expertise as well as a scientific wisdom to draw on and the many experts we work with. We have a core team. It's a small team. It's quite overwhelming to have about 6 FTEs worth of, sorry, that's full-time equivalents worth of people in the core team, supporting this huge hundreds of thousands of people community. And the way we're able to do that without sort of going under, if you like, is partly the resilient skills we develop in ourselves, but it's also the fact this is a volunteer-led movement. So we have an online volunteer training program that's been taken by thousands of people. It introduces them to the mission, but gives them some core skills around active listening and safeguarding and understanding their own mental well-being, so they can then be better placed to do that for others. But these are, I'm delighted to say, people from a very wide range of backgrounds and ethnicities and geographies. And one of the things that you have to do, I think, if you're serious about building a movement for a happier world, is to be diverse and to reflect the many different backgrounds and talents and perspectives that we have as human beings. I don't think we've cracked that yet, but we certainly have a huge aspiration and some success in a really diverse set of experiences. But the really important thing, Chris, is the volunteer-led nature of the activities. We find that if you have an expert that gathers a local group together, it has a sort of parent to child or teacher to student model of interaction. But if you have a well-meaning and well-equipped volunteer, you have more of an adult to adult interaction. Yeah. So the first thing our volunteers say is, I'm here hosting this group or course because I care and I want to make a difference and I want to help you and I want us to have a great experience, but I'm not the expert.
Right.
And that to me is the power of a movement-led approach.
Yes, indeed. That's an interesting distinction, isn't it, between what you might call the expert-led approach, which is in danger of producing the teacher-student relationship or
yes.
or parent relationship, and one where, in a very vital sense, we are equal in this group, and therefore we are a community. I think that's the thing, because community building is such. You mentioned the word nuanced earlier. It's such a nuanced thing to do, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and if I'm honest, we were talking about Action for Happiness as a movement initially when it wasn't really, and it's taken us some years to become an actual movement where it's led more in many ways by the people on the ground than anything done by a small team at the centre. And of course, that brings its risks in terms of coordination, for want of a better word, but it also is it's the way to grow and the way to empower.
Yes, indeed. Are there particular challenges that you face, Mark, as a movement and as an organisation, and you as the director?
Yes, there are, Chris. I think there's an obvious one that every person involved in the non-profit world will be very familiar with around funding. We have grown to be an organisation of the scale of about £400,000 to £500,000 cost base a year, and we have been able to generate that for some years, but it's a constant challenge and something that takes up a lot of my time. I think almost the bigger challenge, though, I've already alluded to as well, which is the potential for overwhelm, obviously in me personally, and I have to have lots of boundaries around my family time and my own self-care in order to be able to keep doing this. But also, when you're a movement, it's 24/7, 365 days a year, with the lovely experience of thousands of people wanting to get in touch with you the whole time. And so you need to be really careful about what you say yes to. And actually, one of our success factors is saying no to 90% of the things that come up in order for us to do the 10% really well. And I think we're still struggling with that, but learning to say no in a compassionate, supportive way is a real skill I have found you need to develop. But there's also a challenge, I think, that the world faces that we're still reckoning with, Chris. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of suffering and mental ill health that many listening will be very aware of. But I think post-COVID, we have a sort of connection or isolation challenge. So a lot of people were forced to disconnect in that period. And we have really struggled to get people to come out and rejoin face-to-face initiatives in the real world. People are happy to meet with others on Zoom and online, and that's lovely, and it's been very enabling in many ways. But there's a sort of social apathy, that I call it now, that people are more reluctant to get back together in person. And I think the implications of that are huge for our societal well-being. And I'm desperate that we remember the importance of being together for our collective well-being.
Absolutely, yes. Mark, I'm really glad you didn't say no to us. That would have been a terrible podcast.
No, this has been a pleasure, Chris.
So we're now wrapping up, and it's been an absolute pleasure working with you. If one wanted to get involved, how would, apart from looking at the website, which we'll mention in a minute, how would one get in touch? Is there an info at or something like that?
Yes, do please contact info@actionforhappiness.org. And if you'd like to direct it to me, you can say for Mark, and that will get passed on. Please do visit actionforhappiness.org, the website, join the movement. You'll be part of this amazing community. We have the free 10 Days of Happiness program, which you can share with anyone that you know that you think could benefit from learning some practical tips to boost their well-being. It's free, it's evidence-based, it works. And there's all kinds of ways that we can all spread the word, but I'd invite everybody listening to also think about this in terms of your own personal mission. And so maybe you could ask yourself, as I have been forced to ask myself many times, what does happiness mean to you? What is it doing? What's going on in your life that really does affect your well-being? And what can you do to nurture that? Because you will be able to be a better human being, a better parent, friend, colleague, social change maker, if you're able to understand yourself and your own well-being better. And I think there's this intimate connection between personal and collective well-being. We have a phrase, happier, kinder, together, with Action for Happiness. And I really believe that we can be happier. And one of the ways to do that is to be kinder. And the best way to do both those things is together.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that. Happier, kinder, together. There we are. I'm repeating it. And I just want to say on behalf of all of us, thank you very much indeed for a wonderful exposition of the organization and, of course, more importantly, the meaning behind it. So thanks, Mark, very much.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you and lovely questions. Really appreciate it.
A pleasure.